Hello and welcome to Decision NYC election coverage from Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. Today, we're pleased to bring you a debate in the general election for Manhattan Borough President with two of the candidates who will be on the ballot. The Borough President is a voice for the entire borough with responsibilities including considering and weighing in on land use decisions, making appointments to various boards and councils, including community boards, and more. The borough president can be a convener and a planner and has an important role in constituent services and a voice in the direction of the borough, its neighborhoods, and the entire city. Voting in this race and the others in the general election ballot will be done through absentee voting, the early voting period of October 23rd through October 31st, and election day is Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021. Along with borough president, also on the ballot this fall are contests for city council, district attorney, public advocate, comptroller, mayor, and more. There are also 5 yes or no ballot questions on state constitutional amendments, and we'll discuss those in a separate show, but you should be ready to vote yes or no on those 5 ballot questions. So with me today for this general election debate in the race for Manhattan Borough President are Mark Levine, the Democratic nominee for Borough President, Michael Lewyn, the Libertarian nominee for Borough President, and unfortunately, Republican nominee Lou Pilifuto was unable to join us for this debate. Thank you both for being here. Welcome. Very quickly for this debate, there will be 1-minute opening statements from the candidates and then a series of rounds of questions from me where each candidate will get about 1.5 minutes to answer each time. We'll have a nice, open, wide-ranging discussion here in our time together. I may ask you follow-up questions, so don't be surprised if I jump in to ask you for clarification or a bit more information. And as we wind down our time, we'll get into closing statements of 1 minute each at the end. All right, so let's get started. I'll alternate different times who speaks first in different rounds, but we'll go with 1-minute opening statements, starting with Mr. Levine and then moving to Mr. Lewyn. Mr. Levine, your 1-minute opening statement, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's great to see you. Thanks to MNN for hosting, and great to see you, Professor Lewyn. I'm running for Manhattan Borough President to fight for our COVID comeback. I've been fighting on behalf of this city my entire adult life, since I graduated from college with a physics degree and became a bilingual math and science teacher at Junior High School 149 in the South Bronx. I went on to found the Community Development Credit Union in Washington Heights, which has made $25 million in microloans, helping low-income families uptown do everything from buy their first home computer to start a small business. I've been honored to represent the 7th Council District in the City Council, representing Northern Manhattan for the past 8 years. I fought for our green space as chair of the Parks Committee. I delivered a historic win for tenants in passing legislation to create a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction in housing court. And I've put my heart and soul into challenging this pandemic as chair of our City Council's Health Committee. I'm running for Borough President now to take those fights to the next level. And I look forward to a spirited debate today to talk about how we can come back as a stronger, healthier, safer, and more just Manhattan.
Thank you. And we'll get into some of those specifics of your vision in just a moment. Mr. Lewyn, your opening statement.
Yes, I'd like to talk about why I'm qualified and what my platform is. I teach land use and other property-related issues at Touro Law School, and most of my scholarship relates to zoning issues. And since the job of borough president is a very zoning heavy job, you appoint community boards that comment on zoning issues. The borough president himself herself comments on zoning issues. So it seems to me this job is actually fairly a good fit for a specialist, which I sort of am. Second, what's my platform? I basically believe the city needs more new housing to bring down rents, and I believe in more permissive zoning in order to help bring down rents. In other words, I believe the law of supply and demand applies to housing.
Okay, why don't we continue with you then, Mr. Lewyn? Let's talk a little bit more about that. Take your vision a little further. What exact, specifics can you put behind that in terms of moving ahead on those land use matters? If you were the borough president, how would that look practically to people? If voters are going to support you, what's that vision really look like in practice?
So what that vision looks like in practice is very limited because the borough presidency, of course, is a fairly limited job. The borough presidency doesn't really have any coercive power. In my case, he just makes recommendations. So the way I imagine it is when zoning applications for more housing come up, I would nearly always come down on the side of more housing, as opposed to the side of making the incumbent residents of a neighborhood happy with their high property values and their great views or what have you. And so similarly, when it comes to community boards, I think community boards tend to be often against new housing. I think because from the standpoint of the neighborhood, it's perfectly rational, for existing residents in each neighborhood to oppose new housing, especially if they own condos that are appreciating in value, but it's not rational for the whole city. So I'd like to see people in the community boards who have that citywide perspective, who realize that even if their neighborhood might be worse off with a new building on the block or no better off, the whole city will be better off if everyone has a new building on the block.
All right, we're going to come back to community boards in a minute. You can talk a little bit more about your vision for how appointments would work if you were Manhattan Borough President. Mr. Levine, a little bit about your vision, top lines. We'll get into some of the specifics, but say a little bit more about how you envision the role of Manhattan Borough President. If you were in that role, what would be your top priorities?
Well, the job is important at any time, as the great Gail Brewer has shown in her outstanding leadership for the borough. But I think it's more important than ever now as we fight to come back from this horrible year and a half. And it's up to the borough president to put forward a bold agenda for how we can come back. Not exactly as the same Manhattan we were in 2019, because there was a lot that was left to be improved at that time. But I want to come back as a stronger, healthier, safer, more just Manhattan. And the borough president has significant tools at their disposal to make that vision a reality. In land use, yes, as the professor mentioned. In the budget, the ability to introduce legislation, over 1,000 appointments on scores of different bodies and entities. What it all adds up to is a really powerful platform for organizing. This is what I've done in the council, not because as one member out of 51, I have absolute power, but I was able to pass historic legislation like that which creates right to counsel for tenants in housing court, because I led, together with my partner and colleague in the council, Councilmember Vanessa Gibson, a 3-year organizing campaign, bringing together labor, faith leaders, tenants advocates, the mainstream bars, and we ultimately won, and we made history on behalf of tenants. This is how I lead in the council and how I'll lead as the executive for the borough during this difficult time where the comeback is on the line in this election, without a doubt.
Mr. Levine, let's talk a little bit more about some of those priorities. Do you have any legislation you're eyeing? You're obviously in the city council now, so I don't know that you'd be sort of holding your powder, so to speak, but do you have any legislation you'd be eyeing to introduce as borough president? If the answer to that is no at this time, are there ways that you would figure out exactly what you want to prioritize by sort of trying to gauge the needs of the borough in a more thorough way than perhaps you've done during the campaign thus far? How's that agenda coming up if you're successful in this campaign for what your legislative priorities would be?
Well, I've mentioned, and we'll talk more about some of my principal goals for this job, including ensuring that we manage this pandemic to the point where it's no longer a crisis, ensuring that we address the deep inequality that's been exposed over the past year and a half, that we address the desperate shortage of affordable housing, that we protect vulnerable tenants, that we bring about a renaissance in green space and public space, that we make Manhattan a global leader in the race to carbon neutrality, and that we harden and green our infrastructure. And all of those goals will in part require legislation. Some of them are budget fights. Some of them are fights to push the mayor, the governor, the president, Congress to act in appropriate ways. But I'll just mention one area that I've been legislating actively and that I intend to continue, which is creation of a public bank in New York City. So that amongst the billions of dollars that we have on deposit on any given day with commercial banks, we can steer that back to an institution that we control, that invests in the priorities of the city for economic, environmental, and racial justice. This is a movement gaining momentum nationally and here in New York City. It was endorsed by a number of the leading candidates in the mayoral race. This has real viability now. I have a number of bills pending in the council now and more that I would seek to reintroduce as borough president in the coming term.
This public bank discussion, how big, what's the vision for how big a public bank in New York City could get? Are we talking about something that's mostly sort of operating on the margins, or are we talking about trying to grow something into a really massive entity?
We don't have perfect information on just how much money the city has on deposit in banks on every day. And so we've introduced a couple of bills that will require much more transparent disclosure of the city's current banking arrangements, including the fees and interest that we pay.
Okay.
But the truth is that we estimate about 10 billion potentially on deposit in commercial banks. If we just took 10% of that and put it into a bank we control, $1 billion to use for affordable housing, for worker cooperatives, for green businesses, for community land trusts, it would be transformative.
Okay.
And it's something that I'm fighting for.
Thank you. Mr. Lewyn, your priorities, do you have legislative priorities? You obviously might have a different philosophy here from Mr. Levine on issues like public banking and eviction protection. I don't know, you want to weigh in on those? Libertarian mindset might be different on these issues, but your legislative priorities as borough president, that is one role, one power, one responsibility of the office. Do you have legislation you'd be eyeing if you were victorious?
Well, I suspect any legislation that I would like to introduce that I would fully believe in would probably be too radical to be passed. I mean, what I mean by that is, first of all, in an ideal world or an ideal city, given New York's problems, I think housing should be a privilege use. That is to say, I think you should be able to build housing pretty much anywhere in the city at any levels of density. And the zoning should essentially exist only to limit commercial and industrial uses and prevent overly obnoxious commercial and industrial uses. I realize that's way too radical for New York City in 2021. In the practical world, what I'd like to do, I'd certainly support any efforts to upzone neighborhoods to allow more housing, preferably on as broad a basis as usual. I want to avoid the mistakes of the Bloomberg administration, because under Bloomberg, what happened is you would upzone Block A, usually like the major streets, but then you would downzone the streets next door, which politically was very effective because it made rich homeowners very happy. The problem is, it also meant you weren't really adding very much to the housing supply. So ultimately, rents kept going up and up and up. So I think I'd like to try to avoid that outcome. Another equity issue in terms of upzoning and downzoning, of course, is that for the past 8 years, the city has generally upzoned poor neighborhoods, but not really done much to upzone rich ones. And I'd like to change that. Ideally, I'd favor more citywide legislation.
And this is where I was going next with Mr. Levine and potentially both of you, although I thought you would get there, Mr. Lewyn. So, Mr. Lewyn, what are there areas of Manhattan particularly that you think need to be upzoned for more housing density?
I mean, I would ideally favor borough-wide legislation. I think generally any place that's above the median income should be especially likely to be upzoned. Downtown is a somewhat tougher nut to crack, only because so much of it is protected by historic preservation laws. But I certainly would support upzoning these very wealthy neighborhoods downtown like Soho and Tribeca as well. And I would say that, and by upzoning, I don't mean the kind of very limited upzonings that we've had where you go from, 8 stories to 10 stories. I mean, my position is that there really should be no limits on the amount of people who should be living on a block.
Yeah, I've seen you put that out. So you have no qualms about a lack of height limits, a lack of super talls, as you've discussed in your campaign. No issue with the size of buildings that might go up in any neighborhood in Manhattan.
Absolutely. I mean, although it's a practical matter, I think construction costs are so high and things like that there's really not going to be much demand for 80-story buildings because they're really expensive to build. I mean, I think really the Manhattan vernacular, other than a few buildings, a few very expensive buildings, are kind of, these 20, 30-story buildings. Like I live in a 20-story building. To me, that's the Manhattan vernacular.
Got it. Okay, Mr. Levine, this is kind of the bread and butter of a lot of the borough presidency debates, neighborhood zonings, housing. You mentioned the desperate need for affordable housing in Manhattan and beyond. How would you approach that part of the job? Are you ready to really work with and convince communities to allow, more housing development as long as it comes with significant affordable housing in a lot of parts of Manhattan? How are you thinking about that part of the job here? And I'll ask, as part of this, we've heard Democratic mayoral nominee Eric Adams talk about wanting to upzone some significant swaths of Manhattan, especially on the west side. He's talked about, 42nd Street on down a bit on the west side. How are you thinking about these issues as you're campaigning here in the general election?
Well, we have a number of urgent priorities. First, the shortage of affordable housing, I think, needs to be called an emergency. So we have to accelerate the creation of new affordable units using every single tool we have. And of course, that's an economic imperative as well, because of the jobs and economic vitality that's on the line. We also have to protect the integrity of neighborhoods, the livability of neighborhoods, the historic heritage of neighborhoods in this borough. It's about striking the right balance. And I do agree with one thing Professor Lewyn said, which is that we've had historical imbalance in the neighborhoods that we've upzoned, which have overwhelmingly been neighborhoods of color in uptown Manhattan and around the city, largely to the exclusion of wealthier and whiter areas. And we really need to have equal sharing of the burdens and benefits of development and city infrastructure. And I'll just mention one proposal that I've been working very hard on that I think illustrates my philosophy, which is I've worked with a really incredible coalition in Morningside Heights, which I represent now, to propose a rezoning of the neighborhood that would add density to the avenues, something that I would presume Professor Lewyn would support, of Broadway and Amsterdam, but would also establish a height limit, particularly for mid-block. I presume that Professor Lewyn would not support that, but we've had a series of wildly out of scale luxury towers emerging in Morningside Heights, mid-block, 30, 40 towers, one that's next to a Riverside church, which will be taller than the bell tower there. And so our goal here is the balance that I described, to add density on the avenues, which will trigger a requirement for affordable housing. So we'll create hundreds of units of affordable housing in a neighborhood that's seen almost none developed. It will preserve existing rent-regulated units, we believe, and will preserve the historic heritage and livability of the neighborhood. This is the kind of balance that I'll look to apply borough-wide as the next Manhattan Borough president.
What's the problem with going a little bit bigger in some places? I mean, if something is an emergency, why not go a little bolder and a little bigger? I mean, isn't it the case that very often, once some medium-sized, buildings go up after a few years, they're completed, and that's just what the neighborhood looks like now. It's not, the construction process is maybe not so fun for, people in the area, et cetera. But is there not a concern about, settling for a lot of half loaves and the problem doesn't really get addressed in the time period it needs to be? In some ways, I can't help thinking about, some of the discussion around the climate crisis. People talk about a climate crisis, an affordable housing crisis, other crises the city's facing. And very often we're talking about very long processes to get to a compromise that sort of nibbles at the problem.
Well, I'm all for upzoning around transit hubs, adding density, and doing it in a way that respects the need for equity in the kinds of neighborhoods that are upzoned. We also have to be mindful of neighborhood infrastructure, of historic heritage. I think if we had 80-story towers in some neighborhoods, it would have a seriously detrimental impact on public life, on park space. Central Park right now is seeing really the southern mile of the park more and more in shadow due to the emergence of super talls. That's already impacting the ecology and usability of the park. Yes, we can add density, but it has to be done with balance that respects the livability, the human scale, and integrity of neighborhoods.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one thing I was going to raise with Mr. Lewyn about a lot of his push for, building bigger and taller, and, issues of shadows and livability in neighborhoods, and also the fact that infrastructure, school seats, all these things have to, come into play when you're adding a lot more people to any area. Let me come back to you, Mr. Lewyn, in just 1 second. Mr. Lewyn, just quickly on this issue, do you see yourself, if you're borough president, trying to really take the lead and push sort of planning and convening on these issues, or do you see yourself more as sort of an arbiter that helps, other parties that are either leading the effort to, whether it's the Department of City Planning or it's private developers, affordable housing developers, nonprofits, et cetera, you're sort of convening, or are you trying to really get to the forefront of laying out a vision for where a lot of housing can be built, and changes to the, what Manhattan looks like?
The borough president needs to take the lead. You need to have a borough-wide, if not city-wide, vision for the future of growth in the city, the future of infrastructure in the city. It's the only way you can achieve equity, equity of capital investments, equitable distribution of things like drug treatment centers and homeless shelters and parkland and transit infrastructure. And it does require a perspective broader than that of simply one neighborhood. It's why the job of borough president is so important. And I plan to lead with that perspective, with a borough-wide vision of the future of Manhattan.
All right, well, maybe we'll come back to that in a minute. Mr. Lewyn, any response to what Mr. Levine said, what I said about, issues related to sort of neighborhood quality of life, park space, shadows? This is obviously a big thrust of your campaign and the borough presidency around land use matters. Any response on that quickly before I ask you something else?
Yes. So speaking of shadows, I'll tell you, I have firsthand experience with, because I live at 57th and 6th, 2 blocks from Central Park. And I've actually been pleasantly surprised by the kind of wonderful balance of sunlight and shade we have in the southern part of Central Park. Yes, it's not all sunlight, but if you want all sunlight, you should live in Jacksonville, Florida, where there's no building over one story, excuse me. But we have sun, but we also have shade from the trees. And yes, maybe a little bit from the buildings, but it certainly doesn't look to me like the super talls really have any effect. Let me talk about the broader issue of infrastructure, because that's obviously that's not just a neighborhood or a block or two. Wherever you go, if there are new people, in theory, that might burden infrastructure. But the problem with that argument is it leads to absurd results. That is to say, if you say, well, let's not build enough infrastructure to accommodate another million people. And so as a result of that, a million people are priced out of the city. So do those million people disappear? No. If they're very poor, they become homeless and sleep on the streets. If they're not very poor, most of them will move to the suburbs or the Sun Belt, and then they burden those places' infrastructure. They move to Houston, that's going to affect Houston's infrastructure. Or maybe to use a more localized example, if they move from downtown Manhattan and instead gentrify Harlem, that's going to burden Harlem's infrastructure. And if they move from Harlem to Staten Island, they burden Staten Island's infrastructure. So it's kind of an argument, it's a slippery slope. No, that's not the right metaphor, but it doesn't have any logical stopping point.
Ben, can I say one thing on park shadows? Look, you look at a park like Madison Square, and because of the tall buildings that have gone up on the southern edge, that park is in shadow most of the time. It's not interplay of light and shadow. It's mostly in shadow. You look at a pocket park like Green Acres in East Midtown, it's potentially going to be in shadow full time. Mm-hmm. And then even parks like Union Square, there's hundreds of thousands of hundreds of thousands of square feet in unused development rights around it. And it could be cast in shadow most of the time. This impacts the usability and the ecology of parks. On a cold day, no one sits in the shade. It's just not comfortable. And so this really does need to be accounted for in the future development plans of the city.
All right, let's leave that part of the discussion there for now. Let's talk about a few other things in our remaining minutes. We're getting low on time, unfortunately. On land use matters, let's talk about this downtown jail plan, what your current stance is, each of you on the plan. It's moving forward. The city council that you, Mr. Levine, are a part of passed the plan to close Rikers Island, build 4 new borough-based jails. That is moving ahead. The city has been, going through the necessary processes in terms of design and leading towards construction. But what's your stance on the future of that? That it could obviously be reevaluated by a new mayor, a new city council, and other office holders come January. So where are you at on that plan moving forward?
Let me just start by saying that Rikers Island is a human rights catastrophe that really should shame the city, should shock the conscience of the city. I remind everyone that the vast majority of people who are incarcerated there have not been convicted of a crime. They're awaiting a verdict. And we're seeing conditions there which really no civilized society should allow. Rikers Island needs to be closed. There's no doubt that a system of smaller, community-based, more modern, more humane jails is much more consistent with the values of the city. A lot has happened in the year since the original community jail plan was approved. I think the pandemic, first of all, because of the economic shock and the challenges to our fiscal situation, I think also changes about understanding about congregate spaces in a post-pandemic world, because of the shock that Chinatown has endured economically, culturally, because of the horrible epidemic of hate it's been exposed to over the last year and a half. For a variety of reasons, I think that the plan needs to be revisited in Chinatown at this point. And I look forward to leading that discussion as the next Manhattan Borough president.
What does that mean, revisited? What could be on the table? I mean, as of now, it seems like these jails may be too small for the population of detained people. There's obviously a lot of moving parts with this, but that population, of course, as you both know, has grown significantly over the last year or so. How could it be revisited? What could be changed in your mind?
There's a question of the cost of the project, of the impact on the neighborhood, but also the way in which capacity is allocated amongst the boroughs. In that, ideally, you want people to be closer to their home so that members of the family can visit. And that would mean that relatively few people should be incarcerated in Manhattan. And so I think revisiting many aspects of this plan, including the way space is allocated amongst the boroughs, is quite appropriate now.
All right, Mr. Lewyn, weigh in on this. Then we unfortunately have to move to closing statements. Go ahead.
Well, I would say the important thing is that we just have to have jail space somewhere. So it all depends on whether there are going to be enough beds in this proposed new Manhattan jail to compensate for the loss of beds at Rikers. It all depends on the detail. And so I look forward to learning more about this.
Do you have a broad position on whether the plan to close Rikers Island jail complex should move forward?
Let me put it this way. Ideally, it seems like it would involve less dislocation to make Rikers, to improve Rikers and maybe build something new on the side of Rikers. But again, there's a lot of moving parts.
All right, moving in, we're gonna keep it with you, Mr. Lewyn, for the first closing statement, then we'll go over to Mr. Levine. If you each could, perhaps as you start your opening statement, obviously in 28 minutes, we couldn't get to even close to everything. There are many issues that I would love to ask you both about that we didn't get to, but maybe you could each start your closing statement with one issue we didn't talk about that is a priority for you, and then move into your closing remarks. Go ahead, Mr. Lewyn.
I'll talk about transportation. And so one of the big divisions in this city is, are we a city of drivers, or are we a city of people on foot and on bike and on subway? And obviously from an environmental perspective, certainly, and from a quality of life perspective, the latter is better. Unfortunately, community boards, I think, generally tend to be more pro-car than the rest of the city. They tend to be people who are older, who are more likely to own cars. So one thing I'd like to do is ensure that, given that probably 3/4 of the borough's households don't own cars, I'd like community boards to reflect that. So that's like my big crazy idea.
Okay, and any final thoughts for voters before we move to Mr. Levine? 30 more seconds.
Yeah, I would just say the biggest difference in terms of issues between me and Councilman Levine, who, by the way, I would have voted for if I voted in the Democratic primary, my impression that he's the best of the Democrats, is I'm kind of like AOC to his Biden. We're both going in the same direction, but I want to move faster.
Okay. Maybe not on specific issue stances, but that's an interesting way to put it. All right, Mr. Levine, a minute to you. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Professor Lewyn. I'm going to take that as a compliment.
You should.
I'm not sure how it was meant, but I've appreciated your policy focus in this discussion. And thank you, Ben, for not just moderating today, but what you and MNN have done throughout this election cycle. It's just been an incredibly valuable contribution to the discourse. So thank you for that. The stakes in this election are incredibly high. And I will mention one issue that we have not spoken enough about, which is the imperative that Manhattan and the world move to carbon neutrality, something that I plan to lead on as borough president, to make sure that we make our buildings more efficient, that we break our dependence on the private automobile, that we expand our urban forest, that we reform our food system, that we electrify everything, and that we prepare for the climate change, which is already here. This is a small island next to the Atlantic Ocean, after all, and it's really outrageous that almost 9 years post-hurricane or post-superstorm Sandy, that we still haven't protected our low-lying coastline, and that we haven't hardened our infrastructure to the point where the subway doesn't have to shut down just because it rains. So I'm going to lead as borough president with ambitious policy on this front. And of course, I'm going to fight for our recovery from COVID, our recovery for small businesses, for the arts, to dramatically increase production of affordable housing, to expand and protect our precious green space. And I will do this, as always, by standing up for science, by standing up for equity, compassion, and clear communication. This is what's on the line when we go to vote on November 2nd and in early voting. And so I ask all of you to join me by going to votemarklevine.com so that together we can imagine a better Manhattan. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Thank you to both candidates for participating in this debate. I hope everybody found this helpful. Find our other debates and interviews as you get ready to vote in the general election, and please do have a plan to vote. Thank you for watching Decision NYC election coverage here on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max. See you next time.